Everybody else, I've seen a lot recently on social media and in podcast and YouTube about the recent documentary Inside the Manosphere and a lot of conversation around this philosophy of gender essentialism or gender complementarianism that is very popular on kind of red pill podcast and Inside the Manosphere, and thinking about differences between men and women and very much wanting to ascribe them to somehow inherently different traits that men and women have because of something related to their chromosome, something related to their biology. When I'm not on this channel talking about crochet and fun books I'm reading and things I'm interested in my real world, my real life, I do a lot of research in the field of psychology. So this week I wanted to talk about some reading I've done. This time, not fiction. This time we're talking a little bit about some of the recent empirical literature, actual real world data on men and women, and some of the things that folks talk about on these red pill podcasts and some of these manosphere influencers talk about that are actually not based in biology at all. Everybody. So as we hop into the conversation about what the empirical literature actually says about men and women and things like intelligence and leadership and personality and emotional reactivity and resilience, it's important to know a couple of things. Number one, there is no one gene, there's no one genetic site, there's no one clear line of heritability that determines any aspect of human behavior, of functioning, of relationship status, of emotionality. These things are not coded on one gene where if something goes this way or that way, or is present in this person or that person, that it doesn't happen. All of these things, intelligence and emotional reactivity and mood and personality and temperament, these are all multiply influenced by genetic information all throughout our DNA as humans. And that piece alone does not determine how we function in the world. Everybody's heard of the relationship between nature and nurture, or nature and nurture both work together to determine how we turn out as human beings. There are so many environmental factors that influence the development of our personalities, our temperament, our emotions over time. There are so many ways in which our upbringing, our experience of adverse childhood experiences, our lived experiences, our enrichment activities, our education, the support we receive, the mentorship and modeling we get from our parents and our communities as far as developing emotional intelligence and being able to cope with stressors. There are so many ways that these things interact with what our genetic information is and our possibilities, our potentials to help shape the person that we are. So for any aspect of human beings, for any aspect of human development that we point to and we would identify as important as a culture, it's not coded on one chromosome. And even more importantly, these are not sex-linked traits. Our emotionality, our personality, our moods, our intelligence, our creativity, our ability to build relationships and bonds with one another, our leadership, our charisma, none of these things are housed on the X chromosome or the Y chromosome solely. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, when we assess these things in human beings from a psychology research standpoint, one of the ways we make sense of what we measure and the data we receive is by comparing the performance of an individual to the performance of others like them at the group level. It's what gives us an understanding of if somebody is performing kind of within an average range or a normal range, whether somebody's high on something, whether somebody's low on something. That comparison framework is called norms. And so when you think about something, for example, like an intelligence test, an individual's performance is compared to what is typical from somebody of a similar age on norms. And if there are aspects of individual difference that create different averages, and that's included in the norms. So for example, with intelligence tests, they are often normed based on age because average scores can vary across the lifespan for a whole host of reasons. Sometimes on cognitive measures, there might be norms based on age and education level. But what doesn't happen in our most robust, well-validated, reliable measures of overall intellectual functioning and cognitive ability is we do not norm those measures based on gender. And that's not because of any political or philosophical reasons. It's when you look at the performances on average of folks and how they perform depending on different aspects of individual difference. Men and women do not perform differently on these measures. If they did, there'd be gender-based norms. They do not perform differently. Statistically, there is no difference. And when we dive a little bit deeper, we find that differences among men on these measures, The differences between men are bigger than the differences between men as a group and women as a group. And the differences among women from woman to woman are more variable than women as a group versus men as a group. So when we think about our most reliable, robust, well-validated, longest running measures of overall cognitive ability and intellectual functioning, there are no differences in performance based on gender. The potentiality, the development is the same between men and women. So if we have content out there or folks saying that men are naturally smarter at XYZ or women are naturally smarter in XYZ, the clinical data, the research data does not bear that out. Now, what we do know is that differences in nurture, differences in lived experience, especially around chronic stressors and adversity, can absolutely have an impact on how somebody develops over time. It can have an impact on our ability to reach our full potential educationally. It can have an impact on our ability to be able to regulate our emotions. It can have an impact on our overall resiliency because chronic stressors and adversity do take a toll on our development. Sometimes that's through epigenetics. Sometimes that's on a direct impact on our neurodevelopmental process, especially if the challenges happen when we are children. For people who are interested in the differences and experiences between men and women and who have an eye towards helping folks to flourish, to reach their full potential, to live their best lives, our focus needs to be on addressing and correcting factors and conditions that do harm to folks as we're young. We need to be thinking about things that impact adverse childhood experiences, things that impact chronic stress, things that undermine our well-being and our resiliency as we are born and grow through childhood and age and build our lives. Because the adverse experiences we have when we are young and the adverse experiences we have as we grow do have an impact on our ability to reach our full potential and can have long-term impacts on how we flourish. An article published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a high-impact peer-reviewed journal, illustrates the impact of gender inequality as one of those adverse experiences that does direct harm. And in this case, because we're talking about gender inequality, we're talking about direct harm to women that impacts their development when they are young and can have long-lasting effects on their ability to reach their full potential and really thrive. And in this particular study, which was published in 2023, and I will provide a link to the study in the notes for this video, the researchers set the stage for their findings by explaining that social and environmental factors are known to impact brain development and health. This is not a new finding. This has been long established through the work on adverse childhood experiences and early trauma. Exposure to events in childhood and adolescence persist into adulthood. The ripple effects for things that happen when we are young continue forward, and often the adverse childhood experiences we are having continue to persist if they're happening within the context of our families. Gender inequality drives some aspects of adverse childhood experiences, and also they themselves, facets of gender inequality, are harmful experiences that impact the development of girls and women. Adverse childhood events have been demonstrated to impact cortical surface area of the brains of children and young people who have experienced them. That's folks of all genders. It also affects the thickness of cortical surface area and hippocampal volume, which have downstream effects on our cognitive abilities and our ability to be resilient to stress. Adverse childhood events include hostile environments due to stigma and oppression. It can also include exposure to poverty and the impacts of poverty on a young child. The mechanisms through which this damage happens or the change in cortical structure happens for folks of all genders include stress physiology, an accelerated aging process, lack of environmental enrichment and education, poor nutrition and healthcare. All of these things affect the developing brain and can curtail development into full potential. In this particular study, the research team examined MRI scans from over 4,000 women and nearly 4,000 men across 29 different countries worldwide. In the countries with the greatest gender equality, there were no significant differences in the MRI scans between men and women. However, as gender inequality in the countries increased, the cortical thickness in the right hemisphere showed a decrease in women versus men. So gender inequality was associated with structural changes in the brain. This demonstrates the harm done by gender inequality in the societies in these countries. And this is especially true in the anterior cingulate gyrus and the orbitofrontal gyrus. And these are areas that are vulnerable to stress-induced changes. These areas are also involved in resilience to adversity. The changes that are noted could also be related or further exacerbated by lower educational opportunities and lower social and cognitive enrichment for girls and women in the countries with the greatest inequality. So the authors note that these results point to the hazardous effects of gender inequality on women's brains and provide direct evidence for neuroscience-informed policies for gender equality. Gender inequality is an adverse childhood experience. Gender inequality is a chronic stressor. Gender inequality does direct harm to women and girls. There is a commonly held stereotype that women are more emotionally reactive than men, and that this is often explained through biological essentialism or blaming hormones or some other aspect of female sex that drives this. A recent study in Neuroscience Bulletin, which is a peer-reviewed, high-impact factor journal, took this head on and demonstrated that emotional reactivity at the cortical level, at the level of our brain doing the processing, is related to gender roles and gender role socialization, not biological sex. So gender roles are the ways that people are socialized to navigate the world, are applied to people based on their biological sex. But these gender roles are heavily culturally and socially determined. It's the way the society, the culture perceives or deems that folks of certain biological sex should behave. Research shows that overt pressure to adhere to gender roles intensifies when children enter adolescence. And gender roles are generally understood to fall on a feminine side or a masculine side. And stereotypically feminine gender roles include aspects such as reduced assertiveness or increased passivity, higher relationship concerns, other types of objectives, and increased social dependence and interdependence. While masculine gender roles are broadly stereotyped to include increased assertiveness and agency, more self-confidence, and enhanced independence. It is very important to note that these are socially shaped roles that are ascribed to folks of specific biological sex. There is nothing sex linked on the X chromosome or the Y chromosome that drives this. And aspects of personality and intelligence and emotional reactivity and charisma and extroversion and all of those things are multiply determined across a range of genetic locations in our DNA, and also heavily influenced by our environmental influences and that nature-nurture thing that we're all very familiar with. So in a recent study in Neurosciences Bulletin from 2021 that I linked to in the notes for this video, the researchers examined the cortical response to emotionally charged stimuli using EEG readings obtained in real time as the participants were viewing the emotionally charged information. The sample consisted of people who were either biologically assigned male or female at birth, but within each group, half of the participants demonstrated more feminine gender role identification and expression, and half demonstrated more masculine gender role identification and expression. So what that means is in the portion of the participants who were assigned to be biologically female at birth, half were more masculine in their presentation, half were more feminine in their gender role presentation. And the same was true for the folks who were biologically assigned male at birth. And what they found is that people with feminine gender role characteristics, regardless of their biological sex, irrespective of their biological sex, demonstrated greater reactivity to emotionally charged stimuli as the EEG was reading their brain reactivity to this information. And then in a subsequent study by the same researchers in the same article, persons with higher feminine gender role characteristics, not biological sex, demonstrated higher rates of anxiety and depression. And these findings were independent of current phase of menstrual cycle for the biologically female participants, which means the current hormonal status of the individuals was not a factor in these cortical findings. So the takeaway from this piece of research is that gender role, which again is a social and cultural prescription of expectations for how folks act and behave and cope and relate interdependently on one another, it's the gender role rather than biological sex that can impact the reaction to emotionally charged stimuli. Another claim that keeps popping up in this gender essentialism conversation is the idea that men are more natural leaders, which by default would make women, I guess, more natural followers. Although we see growing numbers of women in leadership position, it is still far fewer than we would expect based on workforce participation and just population numbers. In 1970, 15% of management roles in the US were held by women. In 2020, 40% of management roles in the US were held by women, and 29% of senior management roles worldwide were held by women. And there have been many studies over the last 50 years regarding the differences in leadership approaches and effectiveness between men and women leaders. And a recent meta-analytic study in the Leadership Quarterly, which is a peer-reviewed journal from 2024, took a direct look at this head on. And there is a link to this article in the notes for this video as well. And a meta-analysis is a statistical method of collapsing or aggregating data across a number of publications so that you have really robust analysis of multiple statistical comparisons involving a whole bunch of participants. That would be much more than one study would be able to access. And also, it's a way of looking from a 30,000-foot view at what a body of research is saying about a particular research interest. In this meta-analysis, the authors examine the data on leadership style and effectiveness between men and women. The data they aggregated came from approximately 600 statistical analyses with sample sizes averaging about 8,000 data points per study. There was a tremendous range there. Some studies were as small as 8 to 10 data points. The largest study in this data set had over 1.5 million people. So this is a really large and robust body of literature. And what they found from this meta-analysis is where gender differences do exist, women leaders are rated as more effective than men leaders, especially with respect to communal leadership strategies such as collaboration and team building, as well as agentic behaviors involving agency, such as goal achievement and competence building. Men are rated across these studies as engaging in less effective and more passive leadership behaviors. So taking a look at this body of research from over the last 50 years, over 600 statistical analyses, the empirical data does not support the assertion that men are naturally leaders or women are naturally not leaders. Rather, the data supports that when folks are asked, women demonstrate more effective leadership strategies. So why does the stereotype persist despite what the data says? Well, first of all, stereotypes. Women are stereotyped as less effective, and that kind of gets wrapped into gender roles and stereotypical expectations that are based in social and cultural mores. There's something called the double standards of competence model, which says that because of men's historic monopolization of leadership roles, they have the benefit of the doubt. People stereotypically think of leaders as men and men as leaders. So if somebody's not doing as well as they could, they get the benefit of the doubt, they get a little bit of grace, and they have greater latitude to adopt whatever leadership strategies they choose, as opposed to women who must prove greater competence in order to access leadership roles and have to adopt the most effective leadership strategies in order to maintain those leadership roles. Other relevant concepts here are agentic deficiency, which is the false stereotype that women have less leadership potential. This is something we're hearing echoed quite a bit in social media and some of the discourse around differences between men and women. An agentic penalty, which is the backlash against women when they are in leadership roles, because being in a leadership role and being ineffective is counter stereotypical for the conventional feminine gender role. Why? Silly girl. You silly, silly girl. You silly, silly girl. We just have one more to go. We just have one. We just have one more to go. Oh. It makes good sense that we're really worried about the well-being of our youth. We know worldwide the rates of adverse experiences and stress are increasing across the board for everybody, not just the youth, but especially for the youth. We know also we see rising rates of internalizing symptoms among youth. And when we think about internalizing symptoms, we're talking about things like anxiety and depression, as well as despair and loneliness. And these are things that folks are very concerned about, very focused on. And of course, as a society, we want to address. A recent publication in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, which is a peer-reviewed, high-impact journal, linked in the video notes here, who looked at sex, gender, and internalizing conditions among adolescents in the 21st century, trends, causes, and consequences. This is not a research study that is gathering new data or completing an experiment, and this is not a meta-analysis. This is a comprehensive review of published literature to synthesize across a range of publications and article type. So this is a comprehensive literature review. And the authors set the stage by describing the fact that worldwide youth are reporting increasing negative experiences across the board. Self-report of negative experiences has been steadily increasing since 2014 and are currently at the highest levels yet. Part of what is evident from this worldwide polling is that this increase in negative experiences bringing with it worry, stress, physical pain, sadness, and anger. Gender inequality and adverse experiences and in opportunities in childhood lead to different outcomes for boys and girls. Everybody's experiencing greater levels of stress. Everybody's experiencing greater levels of symptoms or impact on their day-to-day functioning, but what it looks like is different for boys and girls. Worldwide, girls experience higher rates of sexual harassment and abuse, are victims of intimate partner violence more often, and may be more vulnerable to interpersonal stressors. Girls are also more likely to report fear, irritability, confusion, rumination, or other negative thoughts in reaction to a stressful event. Boys are more likely than girls to experience physical violence or physical conflict. They're also more likely to see somebody die. Boys are more likely to cope with negative thoughts in antisocial, impulsive, or other externalizing ways. Externalizing behavior is disruptive behavior. It's behavior that gets turned outward, and it can also be risk-taking or sensation-seeking behavior like substance use. The coping responses we see, the emotional responses we see between boys and girls is not related to biology. This is not something related to characteristics that are coded on the X or the Y chromosomes. It is related to the gender role socialization that we've been talking about. Worldwide, education has a buffering effect on mental health. Education builds a foundation that helps increase skills. It increases self-efficacy and a sense of mastery. It gives people a greater sense of control and agency in their lives. It ensures future economic stability and financial stress. Poverty is one of the primary stressors worldwide. And it broadens social networks. And we know that folks with more broad or rich social networks are more resilient and have a greater buffering against distress. Anything that reduces girls' access to education undermines this resiliency factor for them. And for all youth, increased economic strain and poverty worsens outcomes. But some studies suggest that the magnitude of the impact may be higher for girls. These are, of course, things that we should be very concerned about, and as a society coming together to intentionally problem solve. The solution to difficulties our youth are experiencing is not to retreat to traditional gender roles or doubling down on false biological essentialism or this language around gender complementarianism. The body of research suggests that the things that we can do to best shield or buffer our youth from these stressors and their long-term effect are improving educational access for all youth, regardless of gender, reducing poverty for all youth, reducing youth exposure to physical and sexual violence, and fostering healthy emotional intelligence and coping in youth, regardless of their gender. So thank you for joining me today as we took a deeper dive into publications in very well-respected, peer-reviewed journals. I hope that this information is helpful. If you have questions or comments, please leave them below. If you'd like to see more content from me, please subscribe, like, share, comment to keep our videos getting out there. You probably saw me fiddling with crochet as we were talking today. Today I was just working on a simple, solid granny square to add as a filler piece for the book blanket that I have been working on to make sure it ends up at the size I would like.